So now that we have a way to pick up extra lives, let's start taking them away from the player. So we're going to go into our game manager script, and we're going to add a new function down the bottom here that we're going to call public void kill player. So this function is going to be very straightforward. Obviously the first thing it's going to need to do is set our player lives to lose a life. So player lives minus equals 1. So that'll take away 1 from our player lives. The next thing we wanted to do is bring our player back to life and move them to a certain position on the screen. So if our player has lives remaining, so if our player lives is greater than 0, or greater than or equal to 0, sorry. If our player lives is greater than or equal to 0, what we'll want to do is reactivate our player. So say, well actually no, sorry. First thing we want to do is deactivate our player before we move him. So we'll say the player dot game object dot set active is false. Then the next thing we want to do is make sure that the shield is deactivated. Although when our player is deactivated, our shield will automatically be deactivated at the same time, so we actually don't need to worry about that. But we do want to say, okay, if our player has any power-ups, we want to immediately get rid of them. So we're going to say the player's move speed should go back to being whatever it is by default. So the player.move speed is equal to just player speed. So it no longer has the speed power-up. We want to turn our double shot mode to be off. So we'll say the player dot double shot equals false, and we've already established that our shield will be deactivated. When we respawn, it would only really be fair to have our shield be reactivated anyway, so we're going to set that up when we get to the point where we're bringing the player back to where they should be. But now that we've turned all these things off, where are we going to bring the player back when they come into the world? Well, if we want to bring the player back into the world, we need to know where that is. So we're going to have to create a new point on our in our Unity scene here. We'll go to our game manager, and we're going to create a new empty object, and we'll call this the player spawn point, and we'll click and drag this over here, and we'll put it just a little bit back from where they are currently at the moment. But we'll put them right in the middle, so we'll make sure on the y-axis they're at position 0. And then back in our script, what we can do is create a reference to that transform we just created. So we'll, just below our player lives, we'll say public transform player spawn point. And then down here in our player, when our player lives are above 0 and we're resetting our player, we can say, okay, the player.position, or sorry, the player.transform.position should be equal to whatever our player spawn point is. So that'll be player spawn point dot position, like that. And then finally, after we've moved the player into the correct place, we can say, okay, now activate the player again. So the player dot game object dot set active is true, and also activate his shield. So we'll say the player dot shield dot set active true. So our player restarts with a shield to protect them, just that little bit, and we're able to continue on with the game. So that's perfectly fine. That's what will happen when our player has another life to give. So let's actually go ahead and just test this out before we do anything else. So we'll go into the game. We'll let it compile for a second or two. And then in our game manager, we need to hook up our player spawn point. So we'll click and drag that into there. We'll keep our eye on how many player lives we have down here. So once we start the game running, I'm going to fly up and get myself hit by some enemies. Not very well, but there we go. We get sent back, and our player... Oh, we haven't set it up that this function will actually be called by anything else. At the moment, our player is still getting destroyed. So, of course, on our bullet controller, what we want to do now, instead of when we check from the player, we just destroy the player. Instead of that, what we're going to do is... No, instead, we're going to find the game manager. We're going to say find object of type game manager, and on the game manager we want to run the kill player script, or this kill player function. So we want to do the exact same over in our hurt player script. So here, instead of where we have the shield being deactivated, here we want to say, okay, the player, kill the player instead of destroying them. And while we're here, any objects that we run into, we kind of want them to be destroyed at the same time as the player's being destroyed. So we'll say destroy game object. So we'll save that. We'll go back into the game here, let that compile again, and now this time we should get our player getting exploded and put back into the position they are in. Well, not exploded. We haven't set any kind of explosion for the player. We can do that as well. It might be a little bit interesting to display to our players the dangers of getting hit. So there we go. We get pushed back to our starting point, and you can see our player lives are getting pushed down as we go. We'll destroy that and destroy our ship. Our player lives go down. We've got 0 lives left, and we've run out of enemies to kill us. So that's fine. But as I said, there's nothing kind of happening when our player gets destroyed. So let's go and add an explosion effect when we get destroyed. So on our game manager, below our player spawn point, we'll create a reference to an explosion object. So a public game object that we'll just call explosion. That's fine. And basically all we'll do is down here, before we move the player, we'll just before we do anything else, we'll just say instantiate an explosion, and the position is wherever the player currently is. So the player.transform.position, and similarly the player.transform.rotation, like that. So wherever the player is within the world, it'll make an explosion, and then he'll reappear back over at the start. So that's all fine and dandy. But what happens when our player has no lives left? Well, if our player lives aren't greater than or equal to 0, then of course they must be below. So what will happen in that situation? Well, we don't want our player to be reactivated. We do want them to explode. So we'll set explosion to an explosion to go off. We also want to deactivate the player, so we'll grab this like this, and we'll pop that in there. And then the final thing we want to do is display a message onto the screen saying, hey, you got killed. So let's go into back into Unity. We're going to add a very quick and simple game over screen into the game, much like we've done previously in our previous projects. To add a bit of a game over screen into the game, we're going to create a new canvas, UI canvas, but instead of just going canvas, we're going to create an image that we'll use. So let's scroll out nice and big. We're going to make this image in the center, like that, and then we're going to scale it out so it's bigger than the entire bit of the canvas there. We're going to change the color so it's a nice dark black, and then make it a little bit transparent, so it just kind of looks like it's overlaying the world. Like we've done before as well, we want to make sure that that stretches out, so when we have different size windows, it covers the whole window. Then onto this, we're going to add a bit of text. So we're going to say UI text that simply says game over. So we'll make this a little bit bigger, center all that, and make our font size bigger. Perfect. That's all we need to do. We're going to save this, and we're going to go back into our script here. We're going to create a reference to that object now. We're going to create a public game object that we'll call game over screen. And basically, as soon as our player runs out of lives, we want to activate that screen. So we'll just say game over screen dot set active true. So our player has ran out of lives. There's no more hope for them. So we'll pop this up on the screen. So we'll just wait for this to compile, and we'll hook this up in our game manager. Of course, we want to deactivate this by default. We don't want that displaying when our players are just running around in the world. Game manager here. Where's our slot for that? I got our game over screen, so we're gonna pop that in there. We're gonna make our explosion for our enemy, which I never, or for our player, which I never remembered to pop into place. And I'm just gonna zoom back in here on the player. The next thing we're going to do is delete this extra life because I don't want to get more lives. I want to make sure that our player can't get any more lives at the moment. I'm going to set our player lives down to be 0. So the first time we get destroyed, we should get our game over screen. So I killed one, but oh no, I've been destroyed. Game over. So our level continues going just the way it is in the background, and that's perfectly fine. We can have our level continue going if we want to. Alternatively, what we could do is, as soon as the player gets killed, set our time.timescale equals to 0. So that'll just freeze the level behind us. We won't be able to see any more of what's going on, but that's okay. Our player's been destroyed. We don't need to get a sneak preview of what's ahead of the player. But there you go. That's our live system now in place. So let's go ahead and add some more interesting things into the game and make a way to display our lives on the screen, and also start adding some score for our player to keep track of.
Konnichiwa.